Today, I'm joined by Clifford A. Kirikoff, who is an educator, former senior professional staff member at the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he has taught at various academic institutions in the UK, including Virginia Military Institute and at Washington and Lee Universities. So welcome to the UK column, Cliff. The topic for today is Christian Zionism, and you have written a book on that. It's entitled Dark Crusade, Christian Zionism and US Foreign Policy. Now, I just want to get kicked off with a little piece of video which you sent me a week or two ago, just to set the scene of the type of Christian Zionism that the United States is seeing at the moment. So let's just have a look at this, and then I'm going to ask you for some comment.
Israel should make the Gaza Strip a parking lot by this time next week. Destroy the whole thing. And anybody that's going to support this Hamas nonsense. Listen, Joe Biden ought to be tried for treason. You understand that? Now, I get it. Obama's the real president behind him anyhow, and so he's the one that ought to be tried for treason. So I hope Netanyahu's a leader and he just mows the whole thing down by this time next week. If you think all this open border stuff is not an opportunity for a bunch of Hamas sleeper cells to come into this nation right now and start killing innocent men, women, and children, you have lost your mind. I'm sick of all these Christians saying we ought to have peace with Islam. Islam is a satanic death cult, and they would cut your head off before I said amen in this sermon if they had a chance to. The Muslim religion hates Jewish people to the core of who they are. What they ought to do is evacuate up there on the hill and get a great big missile and blow that wicked Dome of the Rock plumb off of the spot where it's standing right now, so we can get that third temple rebuilt and usher in the coming of Jesus. That video of that woman that survived the Holocaust in a wheelchair, they snatched her up. Kidnapped a Holocaust survivor by somebody with American dollars in their pocket. From a corrupt government that should have been smoked out months ago when they stole the election to begin with. Yes, I said it.
So, Cliff, as I say, welcome to the program. That is quite a spectacular piece of video. What are your thoughts on it, and how far does that type of attitude rise in US politics?
Well, let's think some context here. First of all, in the last month or so, we've had about 20,000 Palestinians murdered by Israel, and maybe 40,000 wounded, and destruction of hospitals, apartment buildings, infrastructure, schools, etc. So that's the present context of those remarks. As you could tell from his accent, it's a Southern accent, and he's where Christian Zionism has been very strong, traditionally. We can get into that. And you can see that he's unhinged, but that is considered normal, good preaching within this Christian Zionist cult. And as you can also see, he's preaching genocide, beyond violence, genocide, and talking in apocalyptic terms. So we can start with that as a beginning to our conversation. Yes, it's a shocking video, but that's normal within this American subculture. In this particular case, it looks to me like the setting is in a lower middle class type Southern setting of some kind. You see, he has some musicians for that his band, etc. So we have to bear in mind the cultural context as well, and we can get into that also as we go on.
I mean, is it fair to say that the type of demographic that he represents and that crowd represents would be Republican? Clearly, he was attacking Biden and so on, so that certainly hints at that. But is that the general position that's coming from the Republican side of U.S. politics, and is it something that's confined to the southern states, or is it something that's actually right across the country?
I think this extreme fundamentalism is not generally accepted in either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. What we're looking at here is an apocalyptic death cult that within the Christian church, whether it's Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or mainstream Protestant, or Coptic, or any of the Middle Eastern churches, is considered a heresy. So this is not Christian as normally defined by the mainstream Christian churches across the world, including those in the Holy Land, in Palestine. I will say, though, that there are some in Congress and in the Senate who may actually believe this type of end times apocalyptic ideology. I would just say that our new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr. Johnson, has said himself from the very first day he got in, basically, that, quote, we're Christians, so we should support Israel, unquote. So that's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I would also note that in the Senate, in a legislation to support Israel, the vote recently was to support Israel in this Gaza genocide. The vote was 97-0. I'm assuming 3-0 were necessarily absent. So 97 senators out of 100, in our case, voted to support all the actions of Israel in their genocidal policy recently, since October 7 in Gaza. So in answer to your question, yes, indeed, this apocalyptic death cult ideology does appear in certain congressmen and potentially senators. The Speaker of the House himself is from Louisiana, a southern state on the Gulf of Mexico. And his attitude reflects this type of support for Israel among fundamentalists. Now, let me say that the so-called evangelical movement is very large. And within the evangelical Christian movement, there's a left, a center, and a right. So here we're starting on the right-hand side. Within the right-hand side, we have various degrees of rightness, extremists, and the most extreme, which is the one I was writing my book about, the most extreme are what's called the dispensationalists. And that cult started in the United Kingdom in the 1820s and 30s. So in answer to your question about political parties, yes, this is certainly part of the, say, Trump base, of which there are many components. But this type of Christian Zionism would be part of a conservative base in the United States. And it would be considered, just like you saw in that film clip, it would be considered normal in certain cultural subcultures in the United States.
Well, since you've brought up dispensationalism, let's talk a little bit about the origins of this, because, as you say, it began in the UK, and I believe it began because you can see the lighthouse behind me, because we are in Plymouth. Plymouth Brethren and John Nelson Darby. Let's tell us a little bit about the origins of this.
Well, when I was researching the book, the reason I wrote the book, I started working on it in 2005, just after the United States entered the Iraq War. And I had noticed the Christian Zionists pushing for the Iraq War. So in my research, I came across Father Stephen Sizer, Father Sizer, who I think you've interviewed, and his book, which I'm holding in my hand. And that was a great influence on me in terms of identifying the origins of this apocalyptic death cult. And it turns out that a wealthy banker by the name of Drummond, who lived in Surrey, had an estate called Albury, and he gathered a group of friends together to speculate on religious topics. I don't think they had Ouija boards, but they were close to that type of a group. And that group invented the basic ideology of Christian Zionism, dispensationalism. There are other groups of Christians who support Israel for humanitarian purposes. I was not writing about them. I was writing about the most militant group, which is the dispensationalists, who have the most impact on Congress and Washington. At any rate, the Albury circle of banker Drummond, who was quite eccentric and traveled all over the Middle East looking for lost tribes and all manner of idiosyncratic things back in the day. Out of that group came a fellow by the name of John Nelson Darby. And you can Google Albury Circle. It's on Wiki. You can Wiki Darby, John Nelson Darby, D-A-R-B-Y. You can Wiki dispensationalism as a quick start. You can also buy my book. But as a quick start, you can do that. Darby was a defrocked priest from the Church of Ireland and kind of eccentric, to put it mildly. Darby picked up the concepts that the Albury Circle developed, Edward Irving and others within that circle, and developed them into a theory that there are 5 or 7 periods of human history. And we're living in the last kind of period of human history, and that's the end times. And basically, what has to be done is to restore Jews to the Holy Land from all over the world, restore the Jews to the Holy Land, which of course at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. And once you get all these Jews assembled in what is today Palestine, then you could help them rebuild the temple. In this case, you would have the third temple, there having been a first and a second temple. So you would help them rebuild the third temple. And so you would be basically split. You would be pro-Old Testament in your mind, and then you would claim to be Christian, which is a contradiction. At any rate, Darby came to the United States and Canada back during our Civil War period, i.e. the 1860s. So Darby preached this doctrine of apocalyptic death cult, and a group of ministers in Canada and in the United States, and I assume back in England, and maybe even out in Australia and New Zealand. I have no idea about those. I haven't studied them. But within the United States and Canada, we have the rise of groupings of ministers, preachers, who then assembled into large conferences of preachers, big ones, in the later 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, and were preaching or teaching this type of apocalyptic theology. We can call it Armageddon theology. So that's how Darby, as an English fellow, came over to the U.S., influenced certain circles in the ministry, and that's how this we can call it eschatology. That would be the technical word for end times preaching. This eschatology then spread very widely in the United States, particularly in the South, but also in the North, but particularly in the South, but also in the North, even up in as far as New York and such. So that's the origins then of this apocalyptic cult in the United States. By the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, it had really picked up quite a bit of steam. Bible schools were started, seminaries were started, universities or colleges were started, Bible colleges. So this eschatology, this dispensationalism as an ideology spread widely in the United States. And some large denominations picked up this eschatology and adopted it. For example, what's called the Southern Baptist Convention, which is a whole grouping of Southern Baptist churches, millions of people, by the way, adapted this eschatology, this end times idea. So that's, Mike, how things started originally from a kind of a weirdo cult in Surrey, run by a banker who liked to travel in the Middle East. And they picked up this defrocked priest and got him going on it.
I wonder what it clearly has managed to gain a massive foothold in the United States, and it's having a huge political implications, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it doesn't seem to have, at least overtly, doesn't seem to have got the same kind of foothold in other countries, including the United Kingdom. In fact, overtly, I mean, because I mean, if we look at some of the names from early 20th century politics and writings and so on, people that were in the UK, at least Christian Zionists, William Wilberforce, William Blackstone, Sir Mark Sykes Pico, of course, and Balfour, Sir Lord Arthur Balfour, of course. So they, of course, absolutely key in the establishment of the modern state of Israel. So clearly that type of thinking still existed in the UK, but not in quite the same overt way that it does in the United States. Why is it so open and overt in the US, do you think, and not in other countries?
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with your group of folks in the UK. Balfour, as I understand it, grew up in a dispensationalist family. So, and Sykes was eccentric to the extreme and combined all sorts of odd ideas. But in the United States, it was a feature in the South, in the deep countryside, in little churches. And as you saw, this fellow prancing around on the stage in the deep South. He may have been in Tennessee. I forget where he's from. But it became very popular and entrenched in rural areas and in some metropolitan areas. But it was more of a rural phenomenon of basically less well-educated or less educated people. And on the other hand, in the late 1880s, 90s, under Blackstone's influence, wealthy business persons, upper middle class persons in urban areas began to support the idea of the restoration of Jews to the Holy Land, Palestine. And maybe some of this was because of the pogroms in Russia in the 1870s, 80s. Jews were treated very badly, etc. So naturally, there was a sympathy for mistreated people and human rights. But this was mixed with this weird pseudo-biblical concept of the apocalypse at the end of time and end times. But to trigger end times, you had to move Jewish people physically to the Holy Land. This is their scenario. And then that speeds up Armageddon. So you had, in answer to your question, you had this weird cult ideology deeply entrenched in the South. And then also in the North, particularly in wealthy business circles. I assume they're trying to be pious people or, look pious in front of the community, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also in important business and financial circles on the Gentile side. Of course, among our Jewish population, Zionism way back was not looked at well at all. American Jews back then were more reformed from the Reform group, which was assimilated into Americanism, let's say. So among this Gentile group of bankers and industrialists and the Rockefellers, for example, and other famous people, lobbied Congress, lobbied the president, President Harrison back in that day, and also later during and after World War I, lobbied Congress to promote the Balfour Doctrine and the restoration of Jews to Palestine, the Holy Land. So it's operative at various levels of our society. A detailed sociological study would be interesting to see, and there have been a number of those done.
The next thought is, because you mentioned Jewish Zionism here, if we're looking in the modern context at politics in the US today, what is the relationship? Is there a relationship between Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism? And which, if there isn't, which of those two sort of groupings has the most influence in Washington?
Well, all my Jewish friends are from a Reformed tradition, so they're they're militantly anti-Zionist. But this is how that breaks down. During World War II and the horrors of the Nazi era in Germany, even some of the anti-Zionist Jewish community decided, well, darn, to protect Jewish people, we better support Zionism. So therefore, within the Jewish community itself, this comes from the Biltmore Conference, so-called in 1942, is when all of the different Jewish points of view merged together to advocate for a Jewish state in the Middle East. The Jewish Zionist lobby, and when we say Zionist, let's define it. In 1897, in Basel, Switzerland, there was a meeting of international Zionism, that is, international Jewish groups that wanted to create a physical state in the Holy Land. This was the famous Basel Conference in Switzerland of 1897. And I would point out that this is a political project. This type of Zionism is not religious, although it uses religious symbolism. This is a political movement to create a state, right? A state is a political thing. Back in the 1890s, as I said before, there was this Blackstone-influenced, Darby-influenced grouping of Americans who were for restoration of Jews to the Holy Land. Thus, these two groups came into contact and supported each other. And therefore, the wealthy patrons of the Zionists, it's traditional that the wealthy patrons of Zionism are a driving force in the whole thing. This political project wouldn't exist without huge backing from important philanthropic Jewish financial interests. And this goes back even to the 1820s and 30s. I mentioned Drummond was a banker. So within the United States, then, you have what we call the pro-Israel lobby. That's the best way to phrase it, because that's not taken as anti-Semitic. If you say Jewish lobby, that can be taken as an anti-Semitic phrase. So it's always best to use the phrase pro-Israel lobby. Within the pro-Israel lobby, you have the Jewish community, parts of it, or most of it, and these Christian fundamentalists of either the humanitarian type or the dispensationalist type. The dispensationalist type are the most politically active. And you can see that in Congress and even in the White House, the actions of the dispensationalists, preachers, etc., in the Republican Party. Particularly back in the 80s, it was Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and a whole cluster of fundamentalist preachers who got involved with the Republican Party. The party had never been penetrated by this weird culture, but it did penetrate in the 1980s while I served in the Senate. I was in the Senate 1981 to 1992, and I saw this firsthand. And also I saw firsthand the alliance between this Christian Zionist preachers, etc., and their flocks, and the Jewish Zionist types, particularly the New York types, which have all the money and all that, and organizations in Washington, D.C., like AIPAC, American Israel Political Action Committee, very influential. ZOA, Zionist Organization of America, very influential on the Hill. And then on the fundamentalist side, you had John Hagee, so-called Reverend John Hagee, Pentecostalist, and he had an organization and has an organization called CUFI, C-U-F-I. You can Google it. Christians United for Israel, very important pressure group in Congress, actually extremely important pressure group in Congress. And you can go to their website and learn all about them. There is no, I want to point this out, there is no conspiracy at all here. These are open, public groups, what we call lobbyists or lobby groups or influence groups. So there's nothing to do with the conspiracy here. It's just a bunch of very well organized people organized into a lobby to then pressure Congress. And as I indicated before, we saw 97, they have the Senate without a problem. And the House is, you have the Speaker of the House harping on this stuff. So that's the psychology, Mike, in Congress. The psychology is this delusional support for Israel and its various genocidal policies, which of course you've had the genocidal policies beginning in 1948 with the first Nakba. This is just a continuation. Some people call it the second Nakba, but you can also consider it a continuous Nakba. Back in 48, you had strong, congressional support, and the President of the United States, Harry Truman, supported Israel very firmly, recognized Israel very firmly and quickly after it was announced, its formation was announced. On the other hand, back then, the military and others were concerned about an unbalanced policy in the Middle East. And this is an important point I really want to make. From an American point of view, or other points of view, other major powers, what do you have in the Middle East? You've got Israel, you've got the Arab states, you've got Iran, Persia, and you have Turkey. So you have 4 different powers out in that region. And to promote peace, you would want to have a balanced policy and promote peace. But unfortunately, with this support base from the Christian Zionists, our military-industrial complex, the neoconservative policy network, and assorted others are able to push this policy and support this policy in the Middle East, the pro-Israel policy.
That's the open political situation. What about the so-called deep state, the State Department, Department of Defense, and so on, and the officials that are in these kinds of organizations that are also partly driving foreign policy? How much influence does this feed into those groups and the intelligence agencies and this kind of thing?
That's hard to say about the actual religious beliefs of people in the military-industrial complex. Starting with the State Department, of course, back in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s and 70s, the State Department had a very balanced. People criticized it for being pro-Arab, right? So the State Department back then was more balanced on the Middle East policy. Even General Marshall, when he was Secretary of State back in the late 1940s, et cetera, they had a very balanced concept of policy, which actually originally included a one-state solution with everybody, Muslim, Christians, and Jews in one state of Israel, not a partition. But the military-industrial complex, of course, the main motivating force is money, contracts, and billions of dollars in contracts, and trillions of dollars in contracts. So it's really a money thing. The Pentagon has some religious concept or not, I don't know. Although they do allow some of this stuff in the military academies. So you do wonder what the officer corps is really composed of. What the officer corps, what their religious views are, or if they're just cynical and they just want a good job and a bunch of stars on their shoulders. The State Department situation has been changed since the 70s and 80s. There was a kind of a purge of the old school Arabists, that's what they were called, the old ambassadors to the Middle East, to Egypt or Turkey, and the experienced ambassadors and diplomats have been weeded out or not replaced when they retire with similar balanced thinking. And so you've had a trend for 40 years now in the Department of State bureaucracy for a pro-Israel type of approach. And of course, we have Tony Blinken, who's Jewish, from Kiev, originally the family, as our Secretary of State. And his father was a diplomat in the State Department, friend of George Soros. And then his grandfather, Maurice Blinken, was a founder of the American Palestine Institute in the 1945-6, which advocated for Israel. So his grandfather was a leading Zionist promoter back in the late 40s. So that's, if you want to take a look at the State Department, that's where we have ended up. We did have, it's true, Madeleine Albright and Kissinger too, but the staffing now is much more pro-Israel inclined, whatever religious or ethnic group they happen to belong to. It's also in Washington, of course, good go along to get along. I mean, if your job depends on you being pro-Israel, you better be pro-Israel, right? Same with our news media. So there's a go along to get along attitude in the so-called deep state, the various institutions. And you do have to wonder, well, and also I would say in the early days too, CIA was pretty much pro-Arab, we could say, although people like Angleton and some of the others were pro-Israel. So within intelligence circles in the old days, there was a fairly high amount of skepticism about Israel. And that was shared by the old-time military, like General Marshall and others in our military. However, as you say, here we are today in 2023, and basically the deep state in some ways has been sort of Zionized at the higher levels. I would maybe people at the working level, analysts and such at the working level, would not share that pro-Israel point of view. But if you're an analyst at the working level and you are too objective about all this, you may not, have a job, or you may not get your promotion. So there's kind of this insidious thing going on within the deep state bureaucracies that you better go along, or you're not going to have a very good career if you don't.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting, Cliff, because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right up until the mid 80s, probably maybe even later, Britain also was taking a pro-Arab position on many things, votes in the security in the UN and so on, and suddenly in more recent decades that has changed 180 degrees, and I still haven't managed to get to the bottom of where that policy shift happened. and you're saying that similar kind of thing seems to have happened in the United States. So I'm not asking for an answer to that question, but that's an interesting little data point.
Back in the 1980s, when I was in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee, about 1985, in the mid 80s, you started to have a noticeable presence on the Capitol Hill of pro-Israel lobbyists, and particularly the so-called Christian right, and the influence of people like Reverend Jerry Falwell and Reverend Pat Robertson, etc. Now, Bibi Netanyahu at the time, in the mid-'80s, was an ambassador at the UN, and he would come down to Washington and visit and talk with people, and people would go up, staff people in the Senate would go up to see him. So therefore, Bibi has deep experience in, let's say, manipulating opinion and stuff on Capitol Hill. So I noticed that trend by about the mid 1980s, and then it accelerated from there. I also, I'm not an expert on British internal politics, but I do notice that the so-called Henry Jackson Society was founded in London, and that's a neoconservative group of British people, as well as American neoconservatives. So what you saw in the 1980s, which I document in my book, you see a merging of the Christian right fundamentalists that we've been talking about and the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives are basically Cold War Truman Zionists. They emerged after World War II. They had been Trotskyists before in the 30s. But after World War II, this group of intellectuals, the neoconservatives, centered around the American Jewish Committee and its publication Encounter magazine. So you have a fusion then in the 1980s, stronger and stronger fusion of the neoconservatives with the Christian right. The neoconservatives jumped the Democratic Party because President Jimmy Carter in the late 70s was attempting to have a peace policy in the Middle East. So the former neoconservatives, most of whom had been Democrats, hawkish Democrats, bolted to the Republican Party and penetrated the Reagan administration. So then during the Reagan administration, they focused their efforts and on the Pentagon in particular, in order to protect Israel, of course, with some presence in the State Department. So Mike, in answer to your question, what I saw myself in the Senate firsthand was the shift toward a more pronounced pro-Zionism in the mid-'80s and forward, and during the Reagan administration and then subsequent administrations.
I'd be interested in your views of RFK Jr. and his open acknowledgement that Israel is effectively, or his claim that Israel is effectively there as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. What was the word he used? As acting almost like an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And I'm just interested in your views of whether this support for Israel is, or to what degree it is there to deal with the China Belt and Road and the whole BRICS initiative.
Robert Kennedy Jr.'s very frank statement about U.S.-Israel relations, or at least his view of it, represents the general thinking in Washington, D.C. That is to say, Israel is an aircraft carrier or an American proxy state, or a martyr state in the empire. If you go back to the Roman Empire, Israel would be what they used to call a martyr state on the borderlines of the empire. So in geopolitical terms, what we see really, if we compare this to British imperialism in the 19th century under Palmerston, and we take a look at Palmerston's and his son-in-law, Ashley Cooper, and Palmerston's use of Christian religious groups that were for restoration of Jews to Palestine, to the Holy Land. And Palmerston was aiming his geopolitics against the Russian Empire and he wanted to be a bit friendly with the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire. So today, we can see that, as you mentioned, the American and NATO geopolitics trying to break up or interfere with the BRICS strategy or the BRICS cooperation agreements. There's over 150 countries that are members of BRICS. And of course, it runs east-west, even into the Europe. And you have two things going on here. The US-NATO war against Ukraine is blocking BRICS entry into Europe via the geographic space that was formerly Ukraine. We'll have to see how that geographic space works out. But the idea was to block Russia and block China in any connection with Europe via Eastern Europe. These would be land routes, and this would be railroads. So we're talking about railroads here. And we're also talking about pipelines, hydrocarbons, and all that sort of thing, natural gas and oil and all that. So yes, indeed, the policy is intended to block, break up the BRICS grouping, which is growing, actually. It's getting larger and larger. And also to block Russia and from relations with Europe. I will explain one point that actually I wrote this in an article back in 2014 when the Ukraine crisis was heating up, Maidan and all. At that time, I said, for an article in Global Times, which was a Beijing paper, I said that the neocons want to break the ability of the United States to have a decent relationship with Russia and to have a decent relationship with China. That is to say that if the US, Russia, and China all get together, at least on some global issues, there could be stability and some progress in various parts of the world if all three of these major powers, including Europe too, could agree. But by disturbing or breaking the relationship between the US and Russia and US and China, that precludes cooperation on the Middle East. And in the neoconservatives' view, their first and foremost loyalty is to Israel. So they saw that if they can break up the US relationship with Russia, break up the US relationship with China, that helps Israel, because then the three major powers in Europe won't get together and impose some sort of a peace on the Middle East that would maybe involve a two-state solution, for example, and prevent the sort of genocide that's now going on in Gaza and also the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza. So yes, Mike, it's a big geopolitical play on the world stage, and in my view, quite a negative and the wrong way to go.
I think I'd like to invite you to join us again at some point in the very near future to carry on this conversation. That would be fantastic. Before we go, though, the book that I've been reading is Dark Crusade. It's available as a soft cover and as an ebook. Where else can people find you? Where, if they want to follow your other writings on this topic, where can they find that?
Sure, Mike. It's been a great pleasure to be with you today. Interested readers can find my columns, which are a few columns per month, for the China Focus news site in Beijing, China Focus. And I have a column there that appears anywhere from 2 to 3 times, sometimes 4 times a month, depending on the international situation. So China Focus in Beijing is one place. And I also have a similar column for Beijing Review in Beijing, but that appears not as frequently as in China Focus. So I hope people would enjoy reading my book, and I hope people would enjoy reading my columns in China Focus. Interestingly, I'm freer to publish my columns in China than I am in the United States.